What's going on, everybody? Hope everybody's having a good Tuesday. I was listening to some music yesterday, and I was listening to some Leonard Skynyrd, one of my favorite bands of all times. And I was thinking about the first time I ever heard Skynyrd. And I was in this small store that was kind of like a smaller version of Walmart that Sylacauga had. And that's where we bought records, and we bought, little electronic devices and things like that. But that's mostly where we bought most of our records. And for a lot of the young people, you don't know what a 45 is. You may have seen some vinyl albums that have started to make a little bit of a comeback, but the 45 was something really special. And you had to stack them up on your turntable and let them drop one at a time, and they would play through, and that was your playlist. You sorted them down like whatever order you wanted to do it, and then you'd reshuffle them and redo them, and there was no recording of that. And the only recording we had was a little small cassette tape, little small cassette recorder that we would put up against the radio to tape the top 40, and you go back and listen to that with your little recorder. Man, we were really living in the dark ages, as they say. But even then, though we didn't know it, we thought, man, we're really making progress with this music thing. But I was in this store, and one of my guys that helped me learn to play guitar, his name's Tommy Brown, he was in the store, and they had a little area that was all music, just a little kind of cut out spot in the middle of the store. And what you would do is you'd go in there, and you had racks of these 45s, and they'd be 4 or 5 in a slot, and you go up and pull one of them out, and if that's the song you wanted, you went and paid for it, and took it home and played it. But this guy that, like I said, who's a big guitar influence on me before I really knew anybody, he called me over there and said, "Hey man, come here, you gotta listen to this, you gotta hear this. And I think it was around, I might have been 13 years old at the time, maybe a little bit older. But he put this record on, and it was Sweet Home Alabama. It was the first time I'd ever heard it. And, immediately it was just, oh my gosh, that is the best song I've ever heard. And everybody's heard it now. You hear it everywhere you go. You go to a bar, you go to a park, you go to a ball game, you're going to hear Sweet Home Alabama. It's just, it's stood the test of time. Unlike songs that come out today where, it's almost like they're in a race to see how many songs they can put out in 1 week about a truck. I love country music, but most of the stuff they're turning out today is nothing more than, it seems like they might change the chords up just a little bit, change the song up a little bit, and put out a different artist with almost the same type of song. But back to this little store, they had a little place you could demo the 45 before you actually bought it. So we'd go over there, this little record player, and put it on, drop the needle down. You probably heard some people singing about songs, putting the needle in the groove. I know, I believe it's Brantley Gilbert that might sing about that, or Eric Church, one of the two, talks about dropping the needle in the groove. Well, that's what you had to do. You drop it on the thing, and I say drop it. You placed it down as easily as you could because you didn't want to scratch your record. But listening to that opening guitar part, that little riff, I mean, it just got me. It was like, man, that song is the best song I've ever heard. There'll never be a better song. And that was my first introduction to Leonard Skynyrd. And at that point, I bought every album that I could buy going forward for years. And, Sweet Home Alabama is more than just a song. It's an anthem. I mean, it's not just loved here in Alabama or Florida or the South. It's loved all over the country and all over the world. I mean, that's probably one of the most recognizable songs that's ever been played. And I look back at some of the stuff that Skynyrd was doing. They started out playing in very small venues, had a hard time getting started. I mean, they were they were not really immediately received by the record companies, so they had to work pretty hard. I know they cut some of their stuff in Muscle Shoals, but it never got off the ground, and it was at Muscle Shoals Sounds, and the Swampers had left the Fame Studios and gone over and started their own recording studio. And if you haven't been to Muscle Shoals, you need to go up there and tour the Fame Studio and also tour Muscle Shoals Sound. And it's a pleasure to go in there. And there's also the Alabama Music Hall of Fame's not too far away from there, and also Helen Keller's house is in that same area. So you make a day of it, go up there, learn some history. But going back to Fame, when I went in Fame, I was being given a tour by the sound engineer, and we go into the Studio 1, which wasn't the actual studio that most of the people like Aretha Franklin and all the people that cut albums there, Percy Sledge, they were in the other studio, and that was a smaller area, but they had added on and made this big, huge, room where, all these people have done these recordings. And there was Scooter, I can't remember his last name. He played the keyboards, and I know he helped write some of Aretha's riffs on the keyboard. And it was like a Rhodes piano, and I went over and was able to put my hands on it. It's amazing how they even let you touch his stuff. But the sound engineer, there was a guitar sitting there. He said, "Hey man, pick it up and play it." And I was like, "No, only greatness needs to be in this studio," is what I said. He said, "There's been a lot of people that started out just like we did and ended up being, rock stars, superstars. It's kind of like the Rolling Stones, who they did their recording over at Muscle Shoals Sound, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, White Horses was written kind of in the bathroom. I think they were getting high, and they were drinking a lot, and I'm not a Stones fan, but I like that song. But they in the documentary called Muscle Shoals, they talk about how that song was written, and they also talk about how Billy Powell ended up on the keyboards. He was a roadie for Leonard Skynyrd, ended up being in the band. And if you hadn't seen that documentary, it's worth every minute of watching. It's a little bit sad at times, because you're looking back at people that some of them are no longer with us. And Clarence Carter, he wrote a lot of songs. I didn't realize he was a blind guy until that documentary. I've been listening to him when I moved to Myrtle Beach. Stroking was one of the most popular songs on the Strip, and you didn't go into a place that somebody wasn't playing that song. So it was, people would stack their beer cans up, as they're drinking them, and they'd be dancing. And I can't remember exactly what the dance is called, but it's a real popular dance, and they have a festival every year up there at Myrtle Beach. And I lived there for 3 years, and we had fun, but it's like being on vacation all the time. But going back to Skynyrd, today being Tuesday, Tuesday's Gone was one of my favorite songs also, and I wish I could sing and play that song. It's just it just has so much heart to it. And if you think about Curtis Lowe, you think about Freebird. They wanted to cut Freebird down, and Ronnie Van Zant said, "Absolutely not. We're not cutting it down." And then they finally, that song is also like an anthem. It's played on almost every classic rock radio station at least once or twice a day. So, the music lives on, even though all those guys are gone. The original band members are gone. Ed King and Gary Rosenthal were my two favorites, and Steve Gaines obviously was one of my favorites also. But they practiced out. This is when you're a real musician, somebody who is meant for greatness. When you'll go out to a house in the swamp and it has just a little bit of electricity, and you're over there sweating your tail off, trying to write songs, and Ronnie's out there on the pier fishing right next to the Hell House is what they called it. And, you got a couple people in there, playing little riffs that they had done the day before. And listening to a lot of people who, produced and were traveling with the band and everything, said that they played every song they played was exactly the same every time they played it. Like Joe Walsh, if you've ever heard him, well, everybody's heard Joe Walsh, but he kind of ad libs even to today. I mean, he doesn't play anything exactly the same twice. Now it may be the same riff, but he does a little bit of extra stuff to it sometimes to make it sound a little bit different. Probably gets tired of playing Funk 49. I mean, I know I would, although it's one of my favorite songs. But going back to the Skynyrd thing, I remember they played at Rickwood Field, and I wanted to go so bad. I think it was 1977, and I couldn't get a ticket, and it was sold out. I had some friends who went, and that's all they talked about, man, was how Skynyrd just lit the place up. They were a great live band, and I remember back, it's probably been when Guitar Center first opened and moved over in the Hoover side. I heard a guitar player playing in there, and the tribute band, Leonard Skynyrd Tribute Band, which is what they call themselves after that, they were in town, and I heard this guy over there playing, I can't remember if it was Give Me Three Steps or maybe it was Poison Whiskey. It was one of the songs that got really just a great little riff to it, And I heard this guy over there playing, and I knew this wasn't one of your typical come in there and make a lot of noise. This guy was he's the real deal. And I went around the corner and I saw him, and he was playing one of the vintage guitars out of the room that they kept all their expensive guitars in. And I looked around, it was Ed King. And I understand Ed King lived in Atlanta. I think Gary Rossington also lived in Atlanta. But this guy, when I heard him, I was like, I was in awe. I thought I was with, you would have thought I saw Elvis. I mean, I wasn't an Elvis fan. I'm sorry, people. I know that probably disappoints a lot of people, but I was not an Elvis fan. And kind of going into that, Elvis, when Elvis died, I remember my mom crying like a baby, and I couldn't understand it. I was like, what in the world are you crying about, Mom? You didn't even know him. And I mean, they had grown up with him, movies, songs. And then I think it might have been 77 or 78. I had a phone in my room that my dad was a truck driver at the time, and we couldn't be on the phone during a certain time, and that's when I wanted to talk to my girlfriends, and my mom would never let us before call waiting or any of that stuff. So, she made us have to wait till Dad called, and sometimes it'd be 9:30 and on a school night, and the girls just, their parents wouldn't let me talk to them after that. If I called, it's like, well, they're in the bed, and, you should be in the bed too. It's past bedtime. You got school tomorrow. But anyway, so I had my mom got me for my birthday a phone, and I shared it with my sister, and we had our own number, and I get a phone call from a friend who's a bigger Skynyrd fan than I am. It's hard to believe because I'm a really big Skynyrd fan. And he told me, he said, hey, man, the plane's down. Turn on the radio. And back then we had a radio station called K99 that was just unbelievable. All they played was album music. And they had the coolest sounding DJs. They would talk real slow, like K99. It just was awesome. I mean, on the old radios that we had, it even sounded good on them. But I got to listening, and they were doing coverage of it, and they were bringing updates, and they finally had announced that some of the members had died, and they mentioned it was Ronnie Van Zant and Steve Gaines had died, and Cassie Gaines, his sister, who was a Honkette, one of the backup singers, and man, I cried like a baby. So I knew how my mom felt about Elvis. I didn't know any of these guys either, but, I had grown up. And it was a short period of time from the time I heard Sweet Home Alabama to the time the plane crashed. And I remember Street Survivors was one of my favorite albums. I loved Pronounced, I loved Second Helping, but Street Survivors and One More from the Road was probably my two favorite albums that they did. And I remember it might have been midnight on a school night, and I'm in there and I'm listening to Sweet Home Alabama just bawling my eyes out like it was one of my brothers that I had lost. But it's amazing how things kind of come back around when you make fun of your mom for you laughed at your mom for crying about Elvis dying, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're in the same situation. But I understand how she felt after that. So I was a little more. She had a Velvet Elvis too, by the way. That ought to tell you how big an Elvis fan she was. But that was, if you had a Velvet Elvis hanging on the wall, you were a true Elvis fan. And I thought there was only about 2 songs Elvis ever did that I actually liked, and one of them was something about "Burning, Burning Hunk of Love." I liked that song when he did it live in Hawaii, and I did watch those shows, because I loved anything entertainment. And going back to Skynyrd, after when the 10-year reunion came around, a friend of mine at work, he and I got tickets, and we were on the third row. We had connections. My ex-wife worked at the Civic Center, so we were able to get tickets that were real close. And we were debating all day long. Hey man, what's the first song they're gonna play? I'm thinking, they're gonna come out with Sweet Home Alabama, man. They're gonna hit us right off the bat. And he's like, no man, I think it's gonna be Curtis Lowe, or it's gonna be something else. And, we're just sitting there like teenagers, and we're in our 20s, but we're sitting there like, little teeny bops waiting on, the first song to come out. And, Gary Rossington was still with them, and then Ed King was playing with them during that time too. So, Ed King was an amazing guitar player. He's almost as good as Jared Wilder, but not quite. But anyway, so all of a sudden you hear, they started off with Working for MCA, and we never would have thought about that song being the first song that they would have done. I mean, Birmingham was, I don't know what stop it was, but they'd already played a couple other stops, but Birmingham was pretty close to being up there in the beginning. But Johnny Van Zant can sing, but he's not his brother. I mean, Ronnie, if you listen to a Johnny Van Zant Sweet Home Alabama vocal and you listen to Ronnie, it's night and day. And even though he does a great job, and it's one of the, he's probably the only person that can actually get close enough to do Sweet Home Alabama. And just because he had his brother's tone, he just didn't have that same, I don't know, there was something special about Ronnie Van Zant. I was like I said, I was a big fan. Had posters on my wall, and I had every album they ever made at that point. Sometimes you'd scratch an album, you'd have two copies of it, and half the songs on it had a big scratch, so you couldn't play that, because if anybody who knows anything about phonographs knows that if you hit a scratch just right, it'll sit there and play that same note over and over, and it'll just sit there and won't move forward. And then you either bump the record player, and you get real smart, you put 3 or 4 quarters on top of the needle so that it would hold it down so that it would go across it. And of course that probably slowed down, because the reason they call it 45 is because it's 45 RPMs. So because that was the size, it wasn't the size of the record, but it was at the RPMs that it played at, and to get it at the right music, But I remember I was in a band. We were high school band, and had a really good drummer. He's probably one of the best drummers that I've ever played around with. And we had 3 guitars, just like Skynyrd. We mimicked the band, the greatness. We played Sweet Home Alabama, and I remember our last song was Freebird. We played Freebird, and we had a guy who's no longer with us who sang, and all he did was sing, and he came out on stage barefoot, which, that's the first time I'd ever seen him go barefoot, but that was the cool thing to do if you was a rock and roller. You come out barefoot, that somehow that made you a better singer. But his name was Mark Bentley, and not to be confused with Richard Mark Bentley, who was a neighbor of mine. But I think they might have been kin to each other. But Mark, his dad worked for Kimberly Clark at the time, and they moved up to Virginia, and we went and visited him. He lives somewhere right outside of Richmond, and we went up there and visited him, me and a friend of mine that I grew up with, and we went up there in my new Z car. I just got it. I think I had maybe 300 miles on it, and we went up there. It was St. Patrick's Day when we was up there, and we went to this house where it was a kind of like an old Victorian, and we were playing with people that were going to college at, I think it was VCU at the time, and it might still be VCU, but I was playing poker with these guys, and I was taking all their money. I mean, I was taking every bit of their money, and it wasn't that I was a good poker player. It's just that they were so bad that I'd get them, I could bluff them and get them to fold, right in the middle of a hand, and I'd win. I think I ended up getting about $300 or $400, and that was 1984, so that's a lot of money back then. That's probably back up like $1,000 now. But did I feel bad? No, I didn't. I needed money, man. I was broke. I had to have. I mean, that Z car was costing me a fortune, and I was living beyond my means by every stretch of the matter. But I ended up paying that car off and sold it. Probably when I moved back to Chicago, when my daughter was. My oldest daughter was probably only about 2 years old when I sold it, and we had to have a car that had more than 2 seats in it. So you have to make those sacrifices. But going back to Gary Rosington, one of the things and he's the latest member to have passed away, and I watched him wear that cross the last probably 10, 15 years. He always wore a cross on stage, and I believe they were religious. I believe they had found God, and I don't know if it was because of the plane crash they found God, but I happened to catch an interview with Johnny, and he was talking about the Lord. I mean, he's all in, and that makes me happy to see the fact that people that I respect and I watch and I still respect them. I probably won't ever look at Skynyrd the same way, because Gary Rosington not being there, it's almost like, Skynyrd's not, it's not Skynyrd anymore. I know when Ed King came back and played with them, there was a member there, and I think Artemis Pyle and Leon Wilkerson came back on the tribute cheer. So there was a good many people who had played on some of the albums. Now, they weren't original members, not the founding members. They were probably some of the most popular members, because they came at a time when Skynyrd took off. They were just unbelievable. As far as I was concerned, I tried to capture every lick. Give Me 3 Steps was one of the songs we did, and that was my song and the band, and I contributed to that. And then Needle and Spoon was I did there was 3 parts of that. Three guitar parts to that song, and I played the lead part, and then the other guys filled in, and man, it just sounded so good. You're blending those 3 sounds into one, and we had learned to do that, so that made us a little bit better than, say, the average cover band who was doing Skynyrd, because we were trying to mimic what they were doing, and we were pretty picky about how we sounded. I remember the first time that we played, and a bunch of high school guys, and our drummer was the youngest guy. I think he might have been in the 9th grade. We were seniors, and we were playing a show after a football game, a Friday night football game, and we didn't know if we was gonna have anybody there. We were all nervous about nobody's gonna show up. We're gonna have 4 or 5 people here. The director of J. Craig Civic Center come in there and said, "Hey, you guys need to take a look at this." He said, "I think we're gonna end up having to, stop people at the door. We're gonna have to do a count." We looked out the front door in front of Sylacauga High School, and they were backed up all the way down. They could not wait to get in there, and we had the best show. Were we the best, man? Heck no. We did a good job of performing, and we played to the crowd, and they loved it. I mean, I remember on Freebird, I came off the stage and went into the crowd, and I was playing that little lick where they're, holding that note and they're repeating it a bunch of times. And anybody who knows the song knows what I'm talking about. It's in the last part of the lead. And I broke the E string, the high E string, and I was playing it on, I was one string down. I needed that string. So I had to ad lib a bunch of that. And when we hit the ending of it, I mean, we got a standing ovation. So, I mean, we nailed that song. And Mark, he sang that song so well. I mean, it was one of his best songs. And, I miss those days. I miss being in a band, but I remember somebody telling me being in a band is like being married to five guys. And it is, because you can't please everybody. There's always somebody going to be in a bad mood when I think we might have had 6 members. When you're playing with that many people, somebody's in a bad mood at least every practice. So we kept our equipment set up at our drummer's house, and it was over in the rich section, what we called it, because most of us were mill villagers. We grew up in the mill village. Our dads and worked at Avondale, and we were B.B. Comer, but we had our biggest following were Sylacauga people, and those were the across the track people, we like to call them. But anyway, that's the older I get, the better I was, is what somebody told me one time, and that's probably a pretty true statement. But I just want to let everybody know that look back at some of your music. What influenced you? What musical influences made a difference in your life? I can remember songs when I was on dates that will always be with me, and every time I hear that song, I think about her. That's just the way it is. And I think that's the same way it is today. There's songs I hear right now that takes me back to a time that I was dating after my divorce, and there was there was a lot of bad decisions made on my part during those times, and like I said, I always say I'm not proud of that, but I've only got there's probably 2, maybe 3 people that I dated that I really felt like I messed up. They might have been the one. I know one was, and you just I can't go into the reasons why I had to break it off. And by the way, I never broke up with anybody. I knew how to make them break up with me so that I didn't have to be the bad guy. So, I'd over a period I'd study, especially if I knew that it was time to end this relationship. I would find the one thing that I knew that would make them so mad they would throw me out of their life. And it's an art. It's you got to be a great actor to do this, and I'm not proud of it, because I broke a couple of hearts, and they hate me to this day, and I don't blame them. I would hate me too, but I'm not the same person I was during that time. I'm way better. I mean, when I gave my life over to Christ for the 3rd or 4th time, it's probably the biggest time, but I've been all in on Jesus a lot of times, but during that time, I was as far from the church as I could be. Jesus never left me, but I still, I didn't keep him in my life like I needed to. I drank a little bit too much, and did a lot of other things I shouldn't have done. I wasn't mean. I had an agenda, and whenever you got an agenda that's not including the Lord, it never works out for you. So that's probably why I'm alone today, is because of the decisions I made. I mean, I had a really nice lady out of Pensacola that I dated for over a year, and there was logistics started becoming a problem. It's hard to have a long distance relationship, but I loved that girl. She was a good woman, very kind hearted person, probably one of the best people I've ever met. And, as far as attitude, she was the best. She was supportive. Always did something special, for my birthday and things like that. And, I would get up on Sunday. She's a big Christian. I'd get up on Sunday morning, drive to Pensacola, go to church with her and her family, and drive back the same day. I mean, that's how much she meant to me. But, things didn't work out. She had twin daughters that were 15 years old at the time, and she wasn't going to move up here. And at the time, I couldn't move down there. If it was today, I could probably work remotely from there and finish out my career at where I'm at now. So, because we work remote, I work remote 75% of the time, so that's pretty good. But anyway, back to Skynyrd. If pull out an old, get your iTunes out and download some songs and reminisce about it. If you got a Skynyrd song you like, go back and listen to it. I know I've got many memories that include Skynyrd songs and 38 Special. I mean, I was a big 38 Special fan too, and I was an Aerosmith fan too. I Dream On was my favorite song by them. I wasn't a big, the rest of the songs I did, but Dream On was it was one of the best songs that I could remember, and I loved that song. But just Steven Tyler, man, he really wails there at the end. So anyway, as I always say, God loves you, I love you, and remember, all